Hello, I'm Zach again. It's episode 2. Here we go. The topic of tonight's lecture is what I'm calling the masculine principle. And the way you get to this is, I knew I wanted to do a series of lectures. Because I didn't know what else to choose and I was very interested in the topic God, I chose to talk about God for the first lecture. But that leaves the more difficult question, how do you follow that up? What do you do after you talk about God? And so I realized there were two possible approaches to answering that question. One was just pick anything. You can't go after God, so you can pick anything. But the downside of that approach, and why I rejected it, was that if you pick anything, then your lecture series will never end. And I knew I only wanted to have 7 lectures. So I decided to go with the other approach, which is to take God and to cut it up into 2 pieces and just talk about each piece for the next 2 lectures. Now, the traditional way, one of the traditional ways, okay, just the idea of cutting God is a little bit absurd. But on the other hand, you got to get kind of absurd when you're talking about God anyway, and you're talking about anything. And so, the way I see it is, and this is a traditional way to do it, by the way. Here's God. It's like a blob. And the original separation of God in many stories is that one part goes up and becomes the heavens, and the other part goes down and becomes the earth. And usually the heavens are masculine, and the earth is feminine. So that's the way we're going now. It kind of takes a certain amount of courage and guts to divide God up and say, I'm going to cut God in half and talk about one and talk about the other. And that actually introduces the masculine principle, just the idea of dividing something up and saying, this is the thing I'm going to talk about, I'm going to leave the other thing behind. It's sort of almost the essence of the masculine principle. It has a focus on one thing at the expense of other things. In the Taoist religion, which is very famous for the yin-yang symbol, it's pretty traditional to divide God up into 2 pieces. One is yin, one is yang. So we have a good traditional foundation for dividing God up this way in the Eastern religion, the various Eastern religions. And they give equal weight to the masculine and feminine side. But, yang is masculine and yin is feminine. And in the Western tradition, there's still a kind of tradition, and the way the logic works is this. So God makes the first person, Adam, in his own image. So Adam is in the image of God. And there's many Western traditions in which Adam was originally a man and a woman put together. That before, Eve got pulled out of Adam, it was originally like a mixed man-woman thing. And if that's the image of God, then you sort of have the same thing as you have in Taoism. Certainty, order, discrimination, justice, permanence. These are masculine traits. And I want to thank Erica for hosting this episode of Unlicensed Psychology. And I want to tell people that if they want to host an episode, they should let me know, because one of my goals is to be like a traveling mystic or an itinerant, wise guy. So once you divide God up, I started to think, well, is this any good? Is this way of approaching this any good? Can I really just find a masculine and a feminine principle, and can I justify the idea that those two put together equals God? Or is it kind of a lost cause? And after hacking around with the idea for a degree of time, I kind of came up with one theory which suggested that things were not going as well as I thought. Which reminded me of a great hero, a great man, who once, or supposedly, walked the earth. And I will read from the story of that great man, whose name is Don Quixote. This is, does anybody not know about Don Quixote? I'll summarize him if you...
I know about it.
Okay, well, so I'll just summarize for whoever might not. So he's kind of he's getting old, he's like 50 years old, spends too much time studying like comic book, or what were the medieval form of comic books, which is medieval romances. And he doesn't have a family, and he doesn't have like anything to do, basically, and he has too much time on his hands. And eventually he goes crazy, and he decides that what the world really needs is a knight errant in shining armor, running around, vanquishing evil. So he finds another guy, Sancho Panza, who's like a dumb villager who doesn't know anything. And one of his first quests is the thing I'm about to read. At this point, they caught sight of 30 or 40 windmills, which were standing on the plain there. And no sooner had Don Quixote laid eyes upon them than he turned to his squire and said, "Fortune is guiding our affairs better than we could have wished. For you see there before you, friend Sancho Panza, some 30 or more lawless giants with whom I mean to do battle. I shall deprive them of their lives, and with the spoils from this encounter we shall begin to enrich ourselves. For this is righteous warfare, and it is a great service to God to remove so accursed a breed from the face of the earth." "What giants?" said Sancho Panza. "Those you see there," replied his master. "Those with the long arms, some of which are as much as 2 leagues in length." "But look, your grace, those are not giants, but windmills, and what appear to be arms are their wings, which, when whirled in the breeze, cause the millstone to go." "It is plain to be seen," said Don Quixote, "that you have had little experience in this matter of adventures. If you are afraid, go off to one side and say your prayers while I am engaging in fierce, unequal combat." Saying this, he gave spurs to his steed Rocinante, without paying any heed to Sancho's warning that these were truly windmills and not giants that he was riding forth to attack. Nor even when he was close upon them did he perceive what they really were, but shouted at the top of his lungs, "Do not seek to flee, cowards and vile creatures that you are, for it is but a single knight with whom you have to deal." At that moment a little wind came up, and the big wings began turning. "Though you flourish as many arms as did the giant Briareus," said Don Quixote when he perceived them, "you still shall have to answer to me." He therefore commended himself with all his heart to his lady Dulcinea, beseeching her to succor him in this peril. And being well covered with his shield, and with his lance at rest, he bore down upon them at a full gallop, and fell upon the first mill that stood in his way, giving a thrust at the wing, which was whirling at such a speed that his lance was broken into bits. And both horse and horseman went rolling over the plain, very much battered indeed. Sancho, upon his donkey, came hurrying to his master's assistance as fast as he could. But when he reached the spot, the knight was unable to move. So great was the shock which he and Rocinante had hit the ground. "God help us," exclaimed Sancho. "Did I not tell your grace to look well, that those were nothing but windmills, a fact which no one could fail to see unless he had other mills of the same sort in his head?" "Be quiet, friend Sancho," said Don Quixote. "Such are the fortunes of war, which more than any other are subject to constant change. What is more, when I come to think of it, I am sure that this must be the work of the magician Freston, the one who robbed me of my study and my books, and who has changed the giants into windmills, in order to deprive me of the glory of overcoming them. So great is the hatred that he bears me. But in the end, his evil art shall not prevail against this trusty sword of mine. May God's will be done, was Sancho Panza's response. End quote. Don Quixote needs to see the world in clear terms, to distinguish between things and to judge them good or bad. When I decided to do this lecture series, I had to come up with topics. The topics could have been completely delusional, or they could represent actuality, but because I needed a select few topics to put order to the chaos, I just chose something and I am sticking with it. This choosing something and sticking with it is basically a kind of masculine activity. It's what the masculine principle is about in most ways. Often one thing is focused on, and everything else is ignored. We need some division, some order when we examine the world. Such a chaotic world as we live in, it sometimes seems like we are doomed to fail any time we attempt to put order to it. So this idea of taking one idea and sticking with it sometimes runs into trouble when you run into the real world. But I'm going to describe a case in which I found that I didn't seem to have trouble at all. And it actually ties in with the idea of God. Because what we found during the scientific revolution is that there are these laws of physics that rule the universe, and they never change. And I thought, well, that's kind of like a man. You know, he finds one way of doing things, and he doesn't change. So that sort of convinces me that God has a masculine component. Like at least part of God is masculine, because the science suggests that the same rules have been running the universe for 13 billion years, and that they never change, and that they apply to all the matter equally. And that is a certain kind of, like, to me that's sort of like God putting on his armor and running into battle and saying, this is the way it will be. No matter what he comes across, we always follow these same rules. So I definitely saw that in the world of physics. Another thing that is common to the masculine principle is big dramatic events. And there are definitely some big dramatic events that happen on the cosmic scale. You know, like the Big Bang, you know, it's this one instant in which everything changes. And that's pretty masculine moment. Some other moments that happen more often, which I think is particularly interesting, what are what are called supernovas. So there's different kinds of supernovas, but what they are is, over a period of a few months, a star basically explodes, and sometimes leaves a very compact core. But the events are very rare, and in our galaxy, which has like a couple hundred billion stars, or maybe just 100 billion, about every 50 years a supernova will happen. And the most interesting thing about them is that they will outshine the whole galaxy for that really short period of time. Like one star becomes brighter than all the other stars in the entire galaxy. So that's pretty, I don't know, because if you're kind of like me and you're trying to like bring a masculine attitude toward the world, and it's not easy to do, and you usually end up feeling like Don Quixote. you try to bring it to something. You're like, this is how it is, and I'm gonna conquer this. And it turns out it was much different from what you were trying to do. It's nice to know that like some places in the universe actually do have a manliness to them. Let me see. Oh yeah. Okay. So there's an interesting moment in the Bible, in which Jesus said in Matthew 10:34, Jesus says something pretty interesting, which is, "Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be the members of his own household." And that's one of the more surprising things Jesus says. And this whole idea of taking a sword and dividing things up and cutting them is a masculine thing to do. And it kind of smashes things into little pieces. In the West, the system of God goes away from what the Chinese do, which is that they give equal consideration to the masculine and the feminine, the yin and the yang. In the West, what we did was we banished evil altogether. We decided God is going to be completely good. And in the very idea of not giving equal credit to things is a masculine thing. So I would say that the Western civilization is very masculine, whereas the Chinese and the Eastern civilization are very feminine. Which is a really interesting thing that across the whole Eurasian continent, there's like progressions to some extent. Islam is also very masculine. All of the monotheisms are very masculine. And what they do is like they cut themselves off from evil. They say Satan and the devil are just completely elsewhere. And, God is completely good. But another thing that happens is that in our Western culture, we all become these individuals, and we are all like our own individuals. And so in a lot of ways, that masculine force is what gave us our sense of all being these unique, specific units, which is kind of the net result of what happens in the Bible when Jesus brings his sword and he turns a man against his father and a daughter against her mother. That also, in my estimation, is what led to the scientific revolution. Because our Western tendency to divide things up into the smallest possible pieces allowed, Isaac Newton and all these scientists to see all the little pieces in the world. And eventually they discovered all the laws of physics, which are sort of like the latent order of the universe. Insofar as the universe is orderly, it's basically because of the laws of physics and the fact that they never change. Interestingly enough, if they did change, you could imagine sort of like a Harry Potter kind of world, where like there was a lot more magic and a lot more, I think it should happen, so it's going to happen. So there's this kind of harshness that comes with this such a cold, like reliable set of rules. So the set of rules can be good, when they bring order to the chaos, but they can also impose like a very strong harshness, especially psychologically, which is one of the problems we have. We have like, how are we going to deal with all these machines? What do we do with all this technology? And it would have been easier to resolve those questions if the world were much more magical and mystical. And like in the Middle Ages, the alchemists were like the proto-scientists. They were before scientists. And from their perspective, the reality was very magical. And they just didn't know. They didn't have enough information to know what we know now. So it's fun to study the Middle Ages because you can get a sense of how the world is perceived from a much more sort of friendly, feminine point of view.
Hello.
The last thing... So, okay. The last thing that is of great interest to me when it comes to talking about the masculine principle is something for which I have worn a special wardrobe, which I will, I'll show it to you in a second. Anyway, so you can have one way of doing things, like you have like the set of laws of physics which run the universe. But in more earthly terms, you can have competitive ways of doing things, and you tend to get. Let's start like looking at civilizations. You know, we have like our Western way of doing it, and we want to impose that on the Middle East and on other people, and they have their way. And each one of these sort of rigid systems kind of evolves naturally. People don't know that they're Western or that they just are that, and then they see the enemy. There's this conflict, and so this bright orange shirt is kind of like masculinity in its happiness when it is the only one and it's proud to be alone. But I'm going to migrate now to masculinity when it has to fight with other masculinity. And for this, I've worn my Star Wars shirt. Rigid thought systems and rigid ways of looking at the world happen at the very small level with individuals, and they happen at the very large level with entire civilizations. But when you do, it's kind of powerful to, like, you got your lightsabers, and these are like phallic symbols. And, phallic symbols they seem to transcend mere biology in a lot of ways, and they imply this sort of specific rigid way of existing. And, you've got Luke Skywalker, you've got Darth Vader, and this kind of thing happens all the time in our world, where one thought system goes up against, you might just say you have like, your liberals and your conservatives. And they have sort of rigid thought systems, and they're constantly colliding. I have one more essay that I wrote this morning, and I guess I will finish. I'll just finish this. It's good to read something. So, towers and other phallic symbols seem to have special place in masculine psychology. It's probably connected with the idea that one idea, army, city, or person has within it the kind of stability necessary to get things done. Guns and rockets are phallic symbols. The main question I have with phallic symbols is whether they are simply symbolic of the sex act or violent acts they normally represent, or if there isn't some phallic god behind the physical acts, which actually wields more power than the acts themselves. The idea of dividing things up into categories and naming them partakes of the spiritual principle of the air and of the masculinity. It pulls away from the cold, wet earth and into the air where ideas can float freely and arrange themselves at will. Musical notes are kind of like this. I've learned that studies show that women have better memories than men, while men are better at rearranging things mentally in space. What's really hard about modern life for men is that it's hard to figure out what the categories are. Clear lines between good and evil are so hard to come by that men as a whole will take any opportunity they can to go to war with quote-unquote evil, even if there's little practical benefit, as in Iraq and Afghanistan. America has such a huge military and no obvious use for it. There are two possibilities. Either there really are clear categories and we just haven't found them yet, or there are no clear categories and men are screwed. Men's biological bias is towards the masculine principle, which requires clear categories, putting them at a disadvantage in a world with no clear categories. In earliest times, people lived in small groups, and the men's role was to secure the perimeter. Presumably, their spatial reasoning abilities were developed in this environment, where war and hunting were necessary and valuable skills. Modern civilization has no real boundaries. There's no perimeter to protect unless a bunch of men fabricate one out of thin air. The whole idea of immigrants, and we're all worried about these immigrants, that's almost like just a fabricated border. It's like we're making up a border so that we can protect it. In modern society, people play many different roles and have really complex relationships, and almost no one is pure evil or pure good. The same person is us in one context and them in another context. For example, a migrant worker is us when she is picking our vegetables, and them when she crosses the border into Mexico. This kind of ambiguity seems to scramble men's natural instincts to want to protect the borders. Instead of coping, modern men have taken refuge in video games, sports, and other artificial settings in which the borders have been clearly drawn and the sides established. Even modern war itself is arguably such a setting. Modern war is arguably such a setting. The falseness and artificiality of modern wars could explain the astronomical suicide rate for our soldiers, as their Don Quixote psychology wakes up and sees nothing but windmills instead of real enemies. What we need is some kind of symbolic tower, a giant phallic symbol towards which we can devote our energies. In the 60s, the Apollo moon landing served such a role, but that era is gone. Now the end of the world is upon us. On the plus side, women for the first time in history are replacing men in virtually every field. They are not inhibited by the instinct to find and protect the borders, and are doing well at almost everything they are allowed to try. One interesting statistic, which is that when women who seek artificial pregnancy, they have a sperm filtering technique which allows them to choose the sex of their child. And the current ratio in our country, at least, for what sex they choose is they choose a girl 3 out of 4 times. 3 times they want a girl, and only for every 1 time they want a boy. The advantage of being a male is simply gone right now. History is in such a dramatic state of flux that it's hard to know whether the trend in favor of feminine thinking is temporary or permanent. One clear advantage of women is that they can have babies without men. All they need is a donor, Whereas a man would need a much greater commitment from a woman to do the same. Arguably, the reaction against gay marriage, and abortion, is subliminally a way to assert the importance of men onto what would probably otherwise go perfectly well without them. It's a subconscious argument against the real problem, which is that masculinity itself is increasingly obsolete. But on another plus side is that people are flexible. It's possible that the disadvantage men currently face due to their instincts may be exacerbated greatly by cultural norms and expectations, which have failed to catch up with the changing realities. The maladapted instincts may prove to be only a small disadvantage in light of proper insight and education. Like, it's possible that once we learn who we are and we get cultural acceptance for who we are, we might be able to just play along much more easily. But it's also, the opposite is also possible. It's hard to know if the problems we're facing are just built in. So that's just one little thing that I wanted to add at the end, because I didn't know how to fit it into the other part of my lecture.